I need to check the list of used names before writing. The band names are Eleanor, Harold, Brittany, Walter, Margaret Whitfield, Tyler, Brandon, Devon Pratt, Vivian, Nolan, Diane, Dorothy, Patricia Carson, Richard, Carolyn, Lorraine, Ashley, Kelsey, Gerald, June, Suzanne, Amanda, Ivy. I'll use fresh names: Ruth, narrator, grandmother; Caleb, grandson; Sandra, daughter/mother; Frank, abusive partner; Miriam, shelter worker; Dr. Okafor, Caleb's mentor. The night my daughter called to tell me she was signing away her parental rights, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Dayton, Ohio, eating leftover pot roast and watching the 11 o'clock news with the volume too low to actually hear anything. I remember that detail because I've thought about that moment 10,000 times since. And what strikes me every time is how ordinary it was. How completely, terribly ordinary. She didn't even say hello first. "Mom, I need you to go get Caleb." That was it. No preamble, no explanation. Just those 7 words, and behind them, the sound of something I couldn't name yet. Not crying exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they've already cried everything out, and there's nothing left. I said, "What do you mean? Go get him. Where is he?" And she told me. My grandson, my daughter's 12-year-old son, had been at the Dayton Family Shelter on Valley Street for 9 days. 9 days. She'd dropped him off herself, she said, because she didn't know what else to do. She said those words like they were supposed to make sense. Like I didn't know what else to do was an explanation that a grandmother was supposed to hear and nod along to. I put down my fork. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside my kitchen window, the neighbor's porch light was on, and I could see moths circling it in the dark. "Sandra," I finally said, "what did he do to you?" She went quiet. Then, "Please just go get him, Mum, please." I went. I didn't change out of my house slippers. I just grabbed my purse, my keys, and my coat, and I drove to Valley Street at 11:15 at night. And I want you to understand something about that drive. I was 63 years old. I had a bad hip. And I hadn't driven after dark in 2 years because my night vision wasn't what it used to be. None of that mattered. None of it even crossed my mind. The shelter was a low brick building set back from the street, with a floodlight above the entrance and a buzzer on the door. A young woman in a purple cardigan answered when I rang. I told her I was there for my grandson, Caleb, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful. The kind of careful a person wears when they've been trained to be neutral, but they're not feeling neutral at all. She brought me into a small waiting room with plastic chairs and a table with a puzzle on it, half finished. There was a poster on the wall that said, "You are not alone," in blue letters. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. I waited. When they brought him out, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he'd changed so much physically. He was still Caleb, still had his father's dark eyes and that little cowlick above his left ear that had been there since he was born. But something in the way he was holding himself was wrong. He came into the room walking like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. Shoulders in, chin down, arms crossed over his chest like he was cold even though the room was warm. He saw me and stopped. I stood up, and I said his name, and his face just crumpled. Not all at once. It happened slowly, like a building settling. His chin started first, that little tremor, and then his eyes went glassy, and then he was crying in a way I hadn't seen since he was very small, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't make any sound at all. I crossed the room and put my arms around him and held on. He was thin. Even through his jacket, I could feel how thin he was. And I could feel something else, too, a flinch, just barely, when my arms first came around him, a reflex, like being held was something he had to remind himself was safe. We stood there for a long time. The woman in the purple cardigan had stepped out. The puzzle on the table had a piece missing somewhere in the middle, a gap shaped like nothing in particular. I noticed that because I had to look at something other than my grandson's face or I was going to fall apart, and one of us needed to hold it together. When he finally pulled back and wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, I cupped his face in my hands and looked at him. There was a bruise along his left cheekbone, yellowed at the edges, old enough to be healing, but still there. There was a small scar near his eyebrow that I didn't recognize. I didn't ask him about either of those things right then. Later. There would be time later. I said, "You're coming home with me." He nodded, one small, exhausted nod. The woman in the purple cardigan, her name was Miriam, I learned, came back with a clipboard and a look of controlled professionalism that slipped just slightly at the corners when she saw Caleb standing next to me. She explained the process: emergency placement with a family member, forms to sign, a case number. She said they'd need to contact my daughter to confirm she'd authorized my taking him, and I said fine. Call her. Here is her number. I'll wait. It took 40 minutes. At some point during those 40 minutes, Caleb fell asleep in the plastic chair next to me, his head listing slowly toward my shoulder until it came to rest there. I sat completely still. I was afraid that if I moved, he'd wake up, and I wasn't ready to stop watching him breathe. He'd been sleeping on a cot in a room with 11 other people for 9 nights. My daughter had known where he was the entire time and had not called me. I thought about that while he slept. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn something over when you're trying to understand its shape, and I couldn't get it to make sense, no matter which way I held it. Sandra was difficult. She had always been difficult, even as a girl, prone to choosing the wrong people and the wrong situations with a kind of helpless precision that had broken my heart more times than I could count. But this was something I didn't have a category for yet. I found out the rest over the following weeks, in pieces, some of it from Caleb, some of it from the social worker assigned to our case, some of it from Sandra herself on a phone call 3 months later that I still don't fully know how to describe. His name was Frank. He had come into Sandra's life about 2 years earlier, when Caleb was 10. By all accounts, and by Caleb's account, offered quietly and with enormous reluctance, in a therapist's office in Kettering. Frank had decided early on that Caleb was a problem to be managed. Not abused, not at first, just managed. Kept in line, corrected. The corrections got harder over time, the way these things do. By the time Caleb was 12, he had learned to stay out of Frank's way, to eat quickly and disappear to his room, to make himself invisible. Sandra had watched this happen. That's the part I've spent the most time with, even now. She had watched it happen, and she had stayed. And when things got bad enough that she couldn't watch anymore, she had driven her son to a shelter and left him there rather than leave Frank. I'm not going to tell you I understand it. I've read about it. My therapist, yes, I got a therapist too, because you cannot go through something like this and stay intact without some kind of help. My therapist has explained it to me more than once. The psychology of it, the fear, the way love curdles into something you can't see straight through anymore. I understand it intellectually. What I understand in my bones is different. What I understand in my bones is a 12-year-old boy sleeping in a shelter for 9 nights while his mother knew where he was. Getting legal custody took 4 months and cost me $11,000 in attorney's fees. I want to say that plainly because nobody tells you about the money part, and the money part is real. I had some savings. I cashed out part of my retirement account and paid a penalty for it. My sister in Columbus lent me $3,000 without being asked. I paid her back 2 years later, and she cried when I handed her the check, and I told her not to make it weird, and we laughed, and it was the first time I'd laughed about any of it. Sandra didn't contest the custody. That's the thing I've come to hold on to when I think about her. She didn't fight it. She signed the papers without argument, and I've been told by people who know more about these situations than I do that this is significant. That in her own broken, insufficient way, she was trying to do the one right thing she had left to do. Caleb didn't see it that way for a long time. He saw it as being thrown away twice. once to the shelter, once to permanent legal custody of his grandmother. He was very specific about that word, thrown. He used it in a session with his therapist when he was 14, and she told me about it afterward, gently because she thought I should know. I didn't correct him. I didn't argue. You don't argue with a 14-year-old boy about his own grief. What I did instead was show up every day in the small ways that nobody writes memoirs about. I packed his lunch with a note inside until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. And then I kept doing it anyway because he never actually asked me to stop. I drove him to soccer practice and sat in the cold in the bleachers even when he told me I didn't have to. I learned how to help him with pre-calculus at 65 years old, watching YouTube tutorials at my kitchen table at 10 at night so I could sit with him while he did his homework and not be completely useless. He had nightmares for 2 years. I kept my door open. I'm not saying this to make myself sound admirable. I'm saying it because I want you to understand what it actually looks like to raise a child you didn't plan on raising. It doesn't look heroic. It looks like being tired all the time and doing it anyway. It looks like learning that your hearing aids need new batteries at 7 in the morning when you're already running late for his orthodontist appointment. It looks like every ordinary, exhausting, non-cinematic thing you can imagine. And somewhere inside all of that, without my quite noticing when it happened, Caleb started to be okay. Not fixed, not healed exactly, but okay, present. His shoulders came back up. He started filling a room again instead of disappearing inside it. He was 16 when he told me he wanted to be a doctor. We were eating dinner. Spaghetti, Tuesday night. I made it every Tuesday because he'd liked it since he was small, and some things you just keep. He said it the way teenagers say important things, like it wasn't a big deal, like he was commenting on the weather. I've been thinking I want to go into medicine. I put down my fork. I looked at him across the table, this boy who had come to me at 12 years old with a bruise on his face and no luggage, and I thought, of course you do. Because Caleb had always been the child who brought me the injured things. Baby birds, once an entire box turtle with a cracked shell. He'd wrapped it in a dish towel and carried it home very carefully and asked me what we should do. His face absolutely serious, not a drop of irony in it. Of course he wanted to be a doctor. I said, then that's what you'll be. He got a full scholarship to Ohio State. I drove him to Columbus with his things packed into my Subaru, and I helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs on a hot August day, and when we were done, I sat on his dormitory bed and looked around at the cinder block walls and the narrow window, and I thought, look at this. Look at what this boy's become. I cried on the drive home. Not sad crying, the other kind. Medical school was the University of Cincinnati, then residency. Caleb specialized in emergency medicine, trauma, specifically. He told me once that he liked the clarity of it. You come in, you assess, you act. The problem is in front of you and the job is to solve it. No ambiguity. I thought about the shelter, the plastic chairs, the half-finished puzzle. I didn't say any of that to him. He was 31 years old, working at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, when Sandra came in. He called me the night it happened, at 9:47. I know the time because I still have the call log on my phone, and I've looked at it more times than I should. He said, Grandma, something happened at work tonight. I need to tell you something. His voice was level. That is the thing about Caleb. He has the most controlled voice of anyone I've ever known. 19 years of learning to keep himself steady had produced a man who sounds calm even when he isn't. I had learned over the years to listen not to his voice, but to what his voice was doing around the edges. Around the edges, that night, there was something complicated. He told me that a woman had come into the emergency department, brought in by ambulance from an apartment complex in Norwood. Blunt force trauma. Significant internal bleeding. She was in bad shape. He had been the attending physician on duty. He said, I didn't recognize her at first. She was 53 years old now. Her face was different. The years, and it would later become apparent, a continuation of the life she had chosen, had changed her. He had worked on her for several minutes, assessing, ordering imaging, moving with the efficiency that emergency medicine requires, before a nurse handed him the intake chart, and he looked down at the name. Sandra. Her last name had changed. She'd married Frank apparently at some point. Or maybe someone else? The last name didn't match Frank's. He told me he stood there holding the chart for a moment. Not a long moment, the kind of pause that would look to anyone watching like he was just reading. I asked him what he did, he said. I kept working. He said it quietly, not proudly, just factually. I kept working, like it was the only possible answer to that question, which for Caleb, I think, it genuinely was. She needed surgery. He called the surgical team. He stayed with her until she was stabilized and handed off. And then he went and stood in the hallway outside the operating room for 7 minutes. He told me 7 minutes. I don't know how he knew. And he just stood there. A colleague found him there and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He wasn't fine. He told me that on the phone, and it was one of the most honest things he had said to me in years, possibly because it was 10 o'clock at night, and he was exhausted, and the thing he'd been carrying for the last 3 hours was too heavy to be polite about. I don't know what I feel, he said. I said, you don't have to know yet. She survived the surgery. She spent 11 days in the hospital. Caleb was not her attending during that time. He arranged for another physician to take over her care, which is standard practice in situations involving a personal connection, and which I think was also the only way he could have handled it. I don't know if she knew he was there that first night. I don't know if anyone told her, or if she figured it out, or if she was too far under to have known anything at all. What I know is what Caleb told me piece by piece over the weeks that followed. She had left Frank. Finally, after more than 15 years, she had left and she had been doing, in her words, better. And then she had briefly, God help her, briefly let Frank back in to collect some of his things, and he had put her in the hospital. Frank was arrested. He was facing serious charges. This time, finally, it appeared the law was going to do what the law is supposed to do. I am 74 years old. I have spent enough of my life being angry at things I can't change to know that anger is expensive and I cannot always afford it. So I am going to simply say this. It took too long. It took far, far too long, and leave it there. Caleb asked me, about 2 months after the hospital, whether he should reach out to her. We were on the phone again. We talk every Sunday, have for years. It's one of my favorite hours of the week. And he asked the question in that careful, even voice of his, and I could hear underneath it how much he'd been sitting with it. I didn't answer right away. I thought about it honestly, the way he deserved. I thought about a 12-year-old boy in a shelter. I thought about a 63-year-old woman driving on a bad hip in house slippers in the dark. I thought about 4 months of legal fees and $11,000 and 2 years of nightmares in the notes I put in his lunch, until he was embarrassed, and a box turtle wrapped in a dish towel and a scholarship to Ohio State and a man standing in a hospital hallway for 7 minutes with something too heavy to carry and nowhere to put it down. I said, Caleb, I can't make that choice for you, and I won't. He said he knew that. I said, what I will tell you is this. Whatever you decide, whether you reach out or you don't, whether you give her something or you give her nothing, it needs to be yours. Fully, completely yours. Not for her sake and not for mine. For yours. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what would you do? I thought about it. Really thought about it. I think, I said slowly, I would write a letter. I would say what I needed to say, and then I would decide whether to send it. Another silence. That's very therapist-y of you, he said, and I laughed, genuinely laughed, because he's my grandson, and after everything, after all of it, he can still make me laugh on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know what he decided. I mean that literally. He hasn't told me, and I haven't asked. That is not me being coy. That is me respecting the boundary of what is his to carry and what is mine, a distinction that took me several years of therapy and a lot of mistakes to understand. What I know is that he is well. He is doing work that matters to people in the worst moments of their lives. He has a good apartment in Cincinnati with a ridiculous number of houseplants and a dog named after a jazz musician and friends who clearly love him, and Sunday phone calls with his grandmother, and a life that is full and real and entirely his own. I know something else too. I know that the night I drove to that shelter in my house slippers, I did not feel brave. I did not feel like someone who was doing something remarkable. I felt like a grandmother going to get her grandson, which is the most ordinary thing in the world. And also, it turned out the most important thing I have ever done. People sometimes ask me, now that I've told this story a few times to family, to a few friends, once to a woman at my church who was in a similar situation with her own grandchild. They ask me if I have any regrets. I tell them the truth. I regret the $11,000. I regret that Caleb had 9 days in that shelter before I knew to go to him. I regret every minute of those 9 days with a specific, precise grief that I expect I will carry until I don't carry anything anymore. What I don't regret is any single moment of what came after. Not the pot roast I didn't finish, not the house slippers, not the pre-calculus tutorials at 10 o'clock at night, not one Tuesday of spaghetti, not the drive to Columbus with the Subaru loaded up, or the crying on the way home, or any of the thousands of ordinary days that turned a scared, thin boy with a bruise on his face into a man who stands in emergency rooms and saves people's lives. Not one day of it. Not one. He calls me every Sunday. He called this past Sunday, and we talked for an hour and 12 minutes about his dog and a patient who had thanked him and a houseplant he'd managed to kill despite his best efforts. And at the end of the call, he said what he always says, "Love you, Grandma." And I said what I always say, "Love you more." And then we hung up, and I sat for a moment in my kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, older now, 74 and a bad hip and hearing aids that need new batteries, and outside my window the neighbor's porch light was on, and there were moths circling it in the dark. And everything was very quiet, and I thought, look at what we made it to. Look at that. I've been sitting with this story for a long time before I finally decided to tell it out loud. Not because I'm ashamed of any of it. I'm not. But because some things take time to settle before you understand what they actually mean. And I think I finally do. Here is what I believe. As plainly as I can say it, the life Caleb has now did not happen to him. He built it, piece by piece, year by year, out of something that could have broken him entirely and didn't. Not because the world was kind to him, because it wasn't, not because he got lucky, because luck had nothing to do with it. He built it because somewhere inside that scared, thin 12-year-old boy was a person who decided, without anyone telling him to, that he was going to be something other than what had been done to him. That is not a small thing. I want to say that clearly. That is one of the hardest things a human being can do. I think about Frank a lot. Not with hatred, though I won't pretend that's never been there. I think about him as a kind of proof that cruelty has consequences that outlast the moment it's committed. Frank spent years teaching Caleb what it felt like to be powerless, to be small, to be afraid. And what Caleb did with that, what he chose to do, was spend his entire adult life walking into rooms where other people felt exactly that way and using everything he had to pull them back. The cause and the effect, separated by 19 years and a medical degree, but connected as directly as anything I've ever seen. And Sandra. I have made my peace with Sandra as much as I'm able to. Not because what she did was acceptable. It wasn't, and I won't soften that. But because I've lived long enough to know that people who cause great harm are almost always people who are also carrying great harm. That doesn't erase anything. It doesn't give back 9 days in a shelter or 2 years of nightmares or $11,000 in legal fees. What it does is make the story more true, more honest. People are not simply villains or heroes. They are people, and that is both more complicated and more important to understand. What I know about raising children, and I raised my daughter, and then I raised her son, so I have some experience here, is that the most important thing you can give them is not comfort. It's not even love, though God knows love matters. The most important thing is the daily, unglamorous, repetitive demonstration that showing up is what people do, that you pack the lunch again, that you drive to practice again, that you sit with the pre-calculus again, even when you're 65 and your hip hurts, and you'd rather be watching television. Children learn what they live. Caleb learned that the person who loves you keeps coming back. And then he grew up and he went into emergency medicine, where the entire job is to keep coming back to the next patient, the next crisis, the next person who needs someone to stay in the room and not leave. I did not plan any of this. I want to be honest about that. I did not drive to that shelter with any vision of the future. I drove there because my grandson was alone, and that was not something I could allow. Everything that came from that decision, the custody battle, the spaghetti on Tuesdays, the scholarship, the phone calls every Sunday, that night in the hospital hallway, all of it grew from one ordinary act that did not feel, in the moment, like anything more than the only possible thing to do. That is usually how the important things work, in my experience. You don't see them as important while you're doing them, you just do them. And then one day, you're 74 years old, sitting in your kitchen in Dayton, and the moths are circling the neighbor's porch light, and your phone says your grandson called for an hour and 12 minutes last Sunday, and you understand finally and fully what all of it was for.